A much anticipated virtual meeting between the leaders of China and the United States. And also, U.S. President Joe Biden signs his infrastructure bill into law. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Calebs, filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Well, after months of wrangling, the United States will now see more than $1 trillion pumped into infrastructure projects across the United States. We will discuss the impact of U.S. President Joe Biden's bill. But first, let's go to his upcoming virtual meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. It could potentially set the tone for bilateral ties between the world's two largest economies moving forward. And what will be at the top of the agenda? And of course, what are the areas of key cooperation? Well, joining us to add some insight into this, let's bring in our guest in Beijing, Qinduo Xu, the host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend and a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution. Also live at the White House is CGTN's Nathan King, our White House correspondent. Good to see you, Nathan. Welcome, both of you, to the show. A lot to cover. I'm going to start with you, Xu. This is probably the most anticipated meeting between the two presidents of China and the United States in some time. A lot really at stake. Kind of walk me to how we got to this point and what you think some of the main points they're going to discuss during this upcoming virtual discussion.
So you're speaking to me?
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, well, this is, as you said, a lot of expectation out of this upcoming summit because this relationship between China and the United States is one of the most important relationships, if not the most important. And also partly because the U.S., I would say, the change of its China policy from engagement to the one of strategic competition. And then with the competition, we see there are a lot of problems arising between the two countries, starting from the trade war, the tech war, and then it was expanded into the area of diplomatic war. Remember closing the consulate, remembering journalists were basically returned to their homeland, etc. So now, currently, we are seeing that the escalation of tensions over Taiwan. I would say all of the observers would agree this is the most dangerous spot between the two countries. It could lead to military conflicts, if not a full-fledged war. In Taiwan streets, so in a worst scenario. So it's a matter of war and peace because the two countries are most powerful if you take into consideration of their comprehensive, let's say, power, military power, economic power, tech, human resources, etc. So a huge a lot of is at stake. And so the two leaders, it's welcome to see the two leaders, finally they are going to have a virtual meeting to talk to each other and to cover, I would say, a wide range of issues between the two countries. That's also will basically, influence this peace and stability around the world.
Okay. Nathan, Qinduo Xu just covered a great deal of ground. Now, you're at the White House.
He did.
The meeting is going to be happening relatively soon. What are you hearing from Washington and any kind of late developments that you're cued in on?
Well, I can tell you that Washington White House holding his cards close to his chest ahead of this meeting. Look, let's face it, Joe Biden campaigned on the fact that he knew President Xi very well. They met many, many times. Due to COVID and other things, though, the two biggest economies have only talked twice directly at the leadership level in the last 10 months. So very much focusing on this sort of term that they've used, strategic competition, as Qinduo said, although we've heard other variations like vigorous competition, but also cooperating where they can. As we saw, for example, the two climate negotiators in COP26 in Glasgow over the weekend, literally arm in arm negotiating to the last minute. You see how deep the ties run on the biggest global problems. But as you know, there was some deep disappointment in Beijing that the Biden administration essentially continued, especially the trade policies when it comes to China, keeping in in tariffs, etc. And they would like to see some movement on that. Taiwan, also the biggest strategic issue. As you know, U.S. military advisors have been there. There have been upticks in military activity along the Taiwan Strait from the U.S. in the air by Beijing. There has been a real worry in Beijing that the one China policy is dead in all but name, even though the White House have pushed back on that. And so I think that's going to be very important. The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki in her briefing today said that the meeting could go on for about 2 hours. I would expect to go even longer. So what are we, about an hour and a half away from it now, Sean?
Right.
I'm not going to bed early.
Okay, Nathan, thanks. Xu, let me ask you also, getting back to the trade issue, because it's really something that has a global impact, and really the relations between the United States and China have been souring since the Obama administration, but of course the crippling tariffs that were implemented by former President Trump, a lot of people thought that Biden would ease those. That isn't the case. Is there a way for these two countries to move forward? What are your thoughts on this? And if indeed the tariffs stay in place, can these two find some common ground?
I do think so. I think that they can find some common ground, as you said. Those tariffs, they are not good to Chinese exporters, and also they are not good to the U.S. consumers, to the U.S. retailers, for example, if they are importing the Chinese goods over there, especially at a time of rising inflation in the United States. I think, the two sides need to sit down and talk about basically getting rid of that tariffs. And also, obviously, they will discuss this trade relationship between the two countries, but that's fine. And if you often, their problems is, you hear a complaint from Washington about the Chinese practice in this area or that area. I think, of course, Chinese economy as a developing country, there's room for China to continue to increase the access to the market. For example, like intellectual property rights can be obviously be strengthened.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the Chinese, the trend of reform and opening up, for example, China joined the RCEP, Regional Trade Agreement, that will go into effect January the 1st, very soon. And China has applied to join this high standard, free trade pact, CPTPP, previously known as TPP or TPP-11.
Right.
And then China has applied to join the DEPA, basically about the digital economic cooperation launched by Singapore, New Zealand, Chile. So you can see, and in a recent speech at the Import Expo in Shanghai, President Xi Jinping talked about, China is open. China will proactively discuss issues of state-owned enterprises, subsidies. Those are the very sensitive area, and those are also basically the area, other countries they have an issue with the Chinese side in terms of trade. So I would say the trend, looking into the future, China is opening further and further. In that sense, I would say, an economy like the U.S. would find it easier to deal with each other on a more equal footing. The two countries, I would say, trade by nature, it's a win-win, right? You spend some money to purchase something or some service. So trade will benefit the two countries. It has benefited the two countries tremendously. The problem is, why there's a complaint, partly because the globalization. I think the U.S. Side somehow has probably, they could do a better job in terms of distribution of wealth. U.S. companies, U.S. business community obviously benefited greatly from globalization, from trade with China. So is China. And I think it's mostly domestic policy, how to distribute the wealth in a more equal manner.
Exactly.
And reduce the gap between rich and poor, so there will be less complaints.
And it certainly will be at the top of the agenda between these two world leaders. Nathan, I want to switch gears a bit and talk about something the two nations do have in common, and that is focusing on climate change. Although there was a certain degree of disappointment coming out of the COP26 meeting. Talk about that, these two nations that do want to work pushing forward measures to keep the global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees centigrade.
Absolutely, it's the one warm spot in the relationship, and even that's been fraught. But yeah, I mean, you've got to remember when President then Barack Obama was in Beijing and hatched that climate deal with President Xi, which essentially squared the circle between developed and developing nations when it came to carbon emissions, set the stage essentially for most of the world to sign on to the Paris Climate Agreement. And that was so different from the atmosphere that we'd seen in Copenhagen just a few years before. And without that, we wouldn't have the Paris Agreement, we wouldn't have COP26 either. And remember, during the UN General Assembly, President Xi basically said that there would be no Chinese financing for foreign coal plants anymore, that the targets have been reiterated for peak carbon by sometime before 2030, net carbon neutrality by 2050. Now, yeah, there was a lot of hand-wringing at COP26, but I've been to these UN conferences on climate and many things, and, you know, there always is. But the body language in the last couple of hours between the two climate envoys from China and the US was close concentration. They know each other very well, John Kerry and his counterpart. And they basically hammered out a deal that was realistic when it comes to coal. Now, there's been a lot of finger-pointing at Beijing, but let's face it, India was very much, if not more, ahead on basically not committing to the end of coal, and the US too. Remember, Trump country is full of coal mines, even though the number is coming down. So it was a realistic agreement, and I think that's the whole thing with these climate things, is you don't want to make pledges you can't fulfill. That happened, remember, before the Trump administration.
Right.
Then Trump came in and dropped out the Paris Agreement. So I think that's where we're going to see a lot of cooperation, especially, sorry, just to finish my final point, on the technologies of the future. That side agreement on methane was very, very interesting, the language that the US and China cooperating on the technologies that will transform the green revolution.
Okay, thank you to both of you. We're going to leave it there. Of course, be monitoring activities the rest of the evening. Again, thank you very much. But coming up next, U.S. President Joe Biden's infrastructure bill. Can it lift his approval ratings? Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short message.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back, everyone. U.S. President Joe Biden signing the first piece of his Build Back Better agenda into law. It is $1.2 trillion in funds that will be used to rebuild U.S. infrastructure and create sustainable jobs. But where and when will the work begin? To discuss this and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, Robert Patillo. He is the Executive Director of Rainbow Push Coalition. Meanwhile, here in Washington, the rest of our panel, Brian Becker is the Executive Director of Answer Coalition, and Melik Abdul is a political analyst, writer, and Republican strategist. Welcome, you all. I want to start by playing just a quick quote from U.S. President Biden, clearly very happy that this measure was signed into law today. Here's what he had to say just a short while ago.
Let's remember this day. Let's remember we can't come together. Most of all, let's remember what we've got done for the American people when we do come together. I truly believe that 50 years from now, historians are going to look back at this moment and say, that's the moment America began to win the competition of the 21st century. So with confidence, optimism, with vision and faith in each other, let's believe in possibilities. Let's believe in one another.
Well, Robert, I'm going to start with you. The bill obviously is law now. Clearly, Biden very relieved and happy that this measure is on its way. But let's talk about what it's going to take to move this forward. It is a daunting task and requires work from the feds all the way down to the local level, the cooperation, a lot of work.
You're absolutely right. And I think one thing we have to understand is the Army Corps of Engineers issued an estimate a couple of years ago saying that to rebuild America's infrastructure would cost about $20 trillion. Indeed, just to rebuild the nation's power grid, to modernize it to, let's say, the status of a nation like Germany, where they haven't had a power outage in 30 years, or a nation like Japan, or many other industrialized countries around the world, just to do the power grid will cost $2.5 trillion. So while this is a very important step, I don't think it's the transformative and generational step that many Americans were hoping for when you elected a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, and a Democratic Senate. And then I think the sausage is made as a large portion of why people have issues with this bill. At the end of the day, the progressives believe that they were sold out by the Biden administration, siding with the 13 Republicans instead of simply going through and forcing the vote on the Build Back Better plan in addition to or at the same time as the infrastructure plan. So I don't know how this will actually help Biden going forward.
Well, Brian, your thoughts on that? Because clearly there's a lot of frustration across the United States with the Democratic president and democratically controlled houses in Congress. Why did it take this long? And indeed, is there this sort of dark cloud hanging over the Democratic Party?
There is definitely a dark cloud hanging over the Democratic Party. When you think about $1.2 trillion over 10 years, that's $120 billion a year. That's less than 8% of the U.S. defense budget. So it's not transformative. It's not hugely significant. Moreover, I mean, it's been pared down from a $7 trillion plan. And again, the infrastructure is basically a private and public partnership, meaning government is going to subsidize corporations to build bridges and roads. And of course, many are needed. There's 70,000 bridges that are in disrepair, according to the National Association of Engineers on Bridges, 70,000. So it's desperately needed. But this is not just modest. This is just a sort of a shell of what President Biden was proposing when he came into office. And then it was the Democratic Party. The Republicans, of course, want Biden to fail. They've said it over and over again. We want him to fail. Just as they did with President Obama. So they're not going to give Biden anything. But the Democrats control the House. They control the Senate. They have the White House. They can do whatever they want to do as a party. And apparently they don't want to do very much. So I think the fact that Biden's approval rating is down to 41%, this is a squandered opportunity. The country wanted change. He won the election by 7 million votes. Yes, it was narrow on the electoral front, but this is a pretty big popular vote victory. And yet, even with all of that support, that momentum, Biden has not done anything that's going to attract real attention or change the lives of working people. The rest of the social spending bill has really transformative elements in it for working class and poor people, including many who will vote Republican. But Biden isn't even close to approaching that because of recalcitrance from his own party.
Malik, I want to ask you, during his speech today at the White House, Biden said this is proof that Democrats and Republicans can work together. However, we've heard time and again that the 13 GOP members who voted yes on this bill are facing a backlash, even death threats. Is this the future of the Republican Party? Either side with us or get out.
Yeah, so I think we should actually separate the Build Back Better plan and the infrastructure plan. They are two different things. And so there was the bipartisan infrastructure plan that we're referencing really is something that Republicans actually supported. I think the narrative out there is that Republicans haven't supported or willing to work with the Democrats on this, but it's just not really true. We know that there was a $35 or so billion water infrastructure package, a bipartisan package that I believe passed out of committee about 89-2. There was another surface infrastructure package that is included in the larger infrastructure package that we're talking now. So for all intents and purposes, absolutely, this part of the bill or the package definitely is bipartisan. The Build Back Better part of it, which they actually changed because at first they were calling it human infrastructure, that's where you get a lot of the dissent on both sides of the aisle. But I actually think that this is a win. No, I agree with both of my colleagues in saying that this is not enough. Obviously, it's not enough. It never will be enough because the numbers, the needs around the country are so grave. But I will give Biden a win this is actually a win for the Biden administration, irrespective of the larger number that the members of the Progressive Caucus, they actually wanted. This is something that Biden can say that he actually did, but it's not enough. It's not going to be transformative, but it is an example in this particular bill of Democrats and Republicans actually working with each other, because it really did pass out of the Senate overwhelmingly. So I think this is actually a good thing. But the big question is what's going to happen with the human infrastructure package, which includes all the climate change, child care, tax credits, and all of those things. That's where you're probably going to have not just Republicans in opposition, but Democrats as well.
Robert, we have an infrastructure bill graphic showing how the $1.2 trillion is going to be spent, and this is something that the country desperately needs. Everyone agrees on that. Biden is going to be discussing with Chinese President Xi. China is ahead when it comes to this kind of development. Now, will this funding and rebuilding be enough to be competitive in today's global economy?
Not even close. Like, it's not dropping the bucket. It doesn't even touch the bucket for what's going to be needed in order to catch up to other nations. If you fly from LaGuardia to Abu Dhabi or Dubai, you will understand just how far back we are when it comes to infrastructure in this country. And touching back on Malik's point, Malik is absolutely correct. And the reason you have such dissent to the Democratic Party is the only bargaining chip that House progressives had in order to force Joe Manchin and Christian Sinema's hand on voting for the human infrastructure bill was holding back their vote on the fiscal infrastructure bill. So the fact that Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden went behind the progressives back to side with 13 House Republicans in order to do, as you said, a giveaway to lobbyists, a giveaway to the construction industry, a giveaway to the unions, and pushing through $1.2 trillion, that's how you get 19 Republicans in the Senate on board with it. That's how you get 13 House members on board with it from the Republican Party, because they literally just put out a bucket of slop and all the senators could sop it up. Of course they love free money, but when it comes to the things that actually help the American people, that is where we are not going to get a vote on it. And the fact that they took away all the bargaining power that House progressives had, then how is that we're going to get voting rights? How are we going to get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? How are we going to get the rest of the human infrastructure bill when there's now no reason for Manchin and Sinema to ever come to the table and actually compromise with the people who actually got Democrats elected?
Robert, for what it's worth, you got a nice chuckle out of our other guest on the bucket of slop line, but I want to move forward. Brian, we've been talking a lot about the political aspect of all this. Let's talk about how it's going to affect people out across the United States. Inflation is a huge concern right now. The price of gasoline, food prices, everybody looking at everything that's backed up off the coast of California. Listen to what Chuck Schumer had to say about that just a short while ago.
Today, the national average for gasoline is $3.14. It was $2.23 a year ago. But last time we were locked away a year ago, it was COVID. The pandemic was in an apex. Demand was minimal, and so production was as well. But today our economy is reawakening from COVID, and supply and demand can't keep up with the global desire to return to normal.
Brian, people are fed up and they want some answers. They're pointing fingers. Do they have a right to be angry right now?
Yes, of course. I mean, you know, the inflation story is somewhat misleading, I think. You know, one of the reasons there's a labor shortage is many women are not coming back into the workforce. That's a reality. One of the reasons they're not coming back into the workforce is they can't get affordable child care. Since the pandemic began 18 months ago, 126,000 fewer child care workers than there were at the beginning of the pandemic. That means 126,000 people didn't want to be working for $12 an hour with a bunch of kids in the middle of a pandemic when they could go down the street and work at Dunkin' Donuts and make $14 an hour. Wages are so low in this country, and that's not the reason there's inflation. There are labor shortages, and as a result, there's disruptions in supply chains. That does lead to inflation. But the problem is right now in the U.S. government, in the Congress, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are saying, look, because there's a inflationary trends, because there's higher prices, we can't put any more money into the economy. But all of the money that went into the economy, the $5 trillion with quantitative easing and other giveaways to the banks and corporations in the last 18 months, isn't commensurate with what's going on with the rank and file, the millions of people, working class and poor people in the United States who desperately need assistance. And if the government is going to now use inflation as the pretext to not have a social spending program to alleviate poverty, which is actually growing in the United States, then one, the cost of inflation is going to be borne mainly by poor people and working class people. And secondly, it doesn't really stimulate the economy or overcome inflation. So we're in this circular cycle right now. What needs to happen is the government needs to say the needs of working class and poor people, which have been devastated as a consequence of COVID-19, need to come first. And that's what hasn't happened.
Melik, let's pick up on that, because there are a lot of people out there that would say that he was exactly right in what he just said. And the fact that so many government programs that have been there the last 20 months, the stimulus money that comes in, the money to offset rent that so many people couldn't pay, if that money doesn't come through and inflation continues into next year, what kind of situation do you foresee, and do you think that indeed Brian was right in what he had to say?
Yeah, so I actually do believe that this will be a problem next year if inflation continues as it is, if the trend continues as is. It's going to be a problem definitely for the American people, because I do agree with Brian when he said that those at the lower end of the income spectrum are typically those who are affected by things like inflation. But there will also be a problem in the midterms for Democrats. And I think we saw just in the Virginia race that is probably a bellwether for 2022 when it comes to the midterm races. But the idea, and I think that's what actually Senator Schumer was talking about himself, that because there's so much demand out there, that's actually causing inflation. These are very macro discussions. And I know that Donald Trump was criticized for everything from, breaking the supply chain to all of these things, but these are very macroeconomic, very macro discussions. And so we're seeing now with Joe Biden that there's only so much he actually can do to affect things like the supply chain. So the inflation part is really a problem, and it's very, I don't know the answer as far as what Joe Biden can actually do to solve that.
Right.
But I do believe that the American people are owed honest conversations about it. And I don't think, and I will disagree with Brian, I don't think that the problem that we're having in the country is because women aren't working. It is a factor indeed, but there's so many, there are a myriad of factors that explains why we're here today, from people who are just choosing not because they don't want to make, make certain amounts of money or lower amounts of money. There are people who have actually left the workforce to start their own businesses. So there are, a number of things that explains why we're here today, and it can't just be summed up as Chuck Schumer tried to say.
Exactly. Everybody, we are out of time. This discussion could go on, and I really wanted to talk a bit about the reconciliation bill. We'll have to have you back on again soon to discuss that. We're going to leave it there. I'm Sean Caleb's here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching another edition of The Heat.